Of all the shows we have ever done, and in all probability of all the shows we will ever do, the next few are going to be the most disputable, and yet possibly the most fascinating of all. Disputable because I'm going to take some liberties in an area of conjecture, and I'm going to present them which admittedly may or not be whole or complete. They may not even be valid, but they seem very reasonable. I wouldn't present this if I didn't think there was something to it. Unlike some of the other research we have presented on the life and person of Joseph Smith Jr., these next few programs are built on an inexact science, which will never be able to prove one way or another. Nevertheless, the parallels and possible connections of this information are nothing short of amazing, and I believe quite possible that they will help us understand what drove the man Joseph Smith Jr. Dr. William D. Moraine of Graceland College, Grinnell College, and Harvard Medical School wrote a book. He received his medical training at Harvard's Peter Bent Brigham Hospital and Children's Hospital Medical Center and in plastic surgery at Stanford Medical Center. He retired from 2 decades of academic practice, which means he taught doctors medicine, after teaching as a professor of plastic surgery at Dartmouth Medical School. He's the author of more than 100 scientific and literary publications, including this book that's titled The Sword of Laban, Joseph Smith and the Dissociated Mind. What makes Dr. Moraine's work so credible is that he has had decades of hands-on experience with children who have suffered traumatic events in their lives, particularly traumatic medical events. He understands their behaviors prior, during, and after such trauma. Additionally, Dr. Moraine actually taught at Dartmouth Medical School, and this is a school that was founded by a Dr. Nathan Smith, no relation to Joseph that we know of, who happened to be the doctor who operated on Joseph Smith Jr. when he was a boy. This connection will prove invaluable since this author understands the practices and procedures Dr. Nathan Smith used upon Joseph Smith Jr. back then. He has access to all the records. I want to thank Dr. Moraine for his insightful, detailed, and expertly referenced book. By the way, it can too be purchased from utlm.org. Let me begin with a summary of Dr. Moraine's position and then spend the next few weeks explaining how he arrived at these conclusions and then provides amazing evidentiary support for his theory. Simply put, Dr. Moraine believes that Joseph Smith Jr. suffered an extreme and documented early life experience, and he retreated into his mind into a kind of fantasy world of violence, persecution, and revenge from which he would never completely emerge. Then, as an adolescent, another bizarre and documented experience would contribute more fantasies to his already traumatized psyche. Finally, the Joseph Smith as a man would literally face all these same fears from an experience that he has as an adult, which almost reenacts exactly what he experienced as a child. When we detail this in the next week, you're going to be amazed. All of this, add to all of this the fact that his mother and father certainly had magic practices and dabbled in the occult, that he also was born with natural charm and charisma. He had a penchant for storytelling, and you have the root source of Joseph Smith's Mormonism, which Dr. Moraine undergirds with a body of fascinating evidence from things Joseph Smith said and did, beginning with the Book of Mormon. Very little is known about Joseph Smith before the age of 10, or what most people would understand in human beings to be the most formative years. We do know a few things about his family circumstances, however. First, Joseph was born into a family of extreme poverty, with his father having lost all their money to an investment scheme just prior to Joseph's birth. Second, Joseph was a middle child. Alvin was the oldest, and then Hiram, and they were alive at the time when Joseph's parents enjoyed dowry money, which helped them live in kind of a reputable life. Sophronia was born 2.5 years before Joseph, so that's 3 children. Then Joseph was born. 2.5 years later, Samuel was born. Ephraim was born 2 years later, but died. William was born a year later. Then Caroline was born the following year. Then 2 more children were born, Don Carlos and Lucy, later on. So while Joseph when he was 6.5 years old, he was in the middle of 7 children, 4 of them being younger than he was. Referring to Joseph Smith's mother, Lucy Mack Smith, she wrote, quote, "Nothing occurred in his early life except those trivial circumstances which are common to that state of human existence, so I passed them in silence." But she and her son Joseph Smith Jr. both commented on the experience I'm going to detail for you tonight. Looking at the family size and circumstance, it is of no wonder that Lucy Mack Smith couldn't remember anything about Joseph's young life. It's probable she had a hard time giving him any attention at all. I am also a middle child of 6, and older siblings in a family like that, because they're the first teenagers to enter that phase of life, seem to have all the attention in that way. And then the younger kids are needing their parents for mere survival. So us younger guys our middle guys are just left to wander the streets aimlessly. It's just a fact in families, and they have like the middle child syndrome, and they have the oldest child syndrome and things like that. However that plays into it. I would suggest, though, that Joseph felt shorthanded in the parental attention department. Dr. Moraine suggests the same, and as a result, he would develop a need for attention. It's possible that Joseph actually received this attention during the only recorded event of his life prior to 10 years of age, when he was only a 6-year-old boy about to turn 7. Now, I want you to take a moment here and just try to imagine this. The size of the family, the absolutely dire financial circumstances, the parents' allegiance to magical practices and mystical thinking, and this 6-year-old child lacking attention. You got it? In 1812 to 1813, a typhoid epidemic swept through the Connecticut River Valley, and Sophronia was the first in the Smith family to be hit. After 3 months of care, the family physician essentially gave her up for lost, and Lucy, the mother, decided that she was going to step in and save her. Lucy, in her retrospective memoirs, which were penned years later after she was in the church, wrote that it was her, quote, "pleas to God in prayer and supplication that saved the child." But other documents strongly suggest that in the Smith family there would also have been a variety of magical incantations and occult-like appeals to aid in her healing. Soon Hiram was attacked with the disease, then Alvin, and then the 4 other children, all in this home. Joseph's mother had been pushed to the brink of exhaustion. But it was Joseph, the 6-year-old, who would develop complications to this disease. This would be a blessing and a curse because, on one hand, how and where the disease reformed in his body would create in him intolerable pain. But on the other hand, it would also gain him, at least in part, the attentions of his mother. After 2 weeks of fever, a painful abscess formed in the lymph nodes of Joseph's left upper arm. A doctor was brought in, and of typical country doctors of the day, he misdiagnosed the pain as a sprain and suggested what they called a hot shovel, which was merely some sort of warm compress. For 2 weeks, the pain increased, as much as would the fulfillment of his desires from attention from his mother, who, according to the Oedipal theory, would serve as an age-appropriate object of Joseph's fantasies. It is suggested that around this age, boys tend to look at their mothers with a certain attraction, and that they often fantasize about rescuing their mothers from this difficult life they have with their husbands and seek to kill the husband, which they would never do, but it's this fantasy that some say, children have. I'm not saying I buy into it or not, it's a theory. A second visit by the doctor was required as the pain and swelling became intolerable for this 6-year-old. This time, the doctor took a medical scalpel and plunged it into this swollen skin without anesthesia and released of what was described as a full quart of pus. Dr. Moraine states that while nothing more is known about this operation, the event of men coming in bearing knives in association to the feelings the young boy would have for his mother and her attentions would be of great interest. Because the pain was relieved, however, the event would have been easily forgotten and dealt with normally, as with most people. We all have traumatic experiences like that. But there were further complications. The bacteria Salmonella typhi spread to Joseph's bloodstream and then found another home in the upper portion of his left tibia, with the marrow being replaced by a second abscess. Dr. Moraine writes that an infection in this area of the periosteal can be more severe than in any other part of the body. This pain went untreated by medical doctors for more than 2 weeks. A 6-year-old boy, attention from his mother, and his age-appropriate inclinations and ideations of his mother, and extreme pain. Just keep doing the math. From his vast experience in dealing with children in pain, Dr. Moraine writes that any 7-year-old would have found such a noxious event to be terrifyingly frightening and excruciating. To add to his ministry, under the added strain of Joseph's illness, Joseph's mother, Lucy, could not contribute her attentions any longer. She wrote, "During this time, I carried him much of the time in my arms in order to mitigate his suffering as much as possible. In consequence, I was taken very ill myself. The anxiety of my mind that I experienced, together with my physical overexertion, was too much for my constitution, and my nature sank under it." Remember our talking about David, Joseph's son, last week, that he too, as an adult, talked about his anxiety of his mind, and he described himself also as sinking. After 3 weeks of sheer agony, the Smith parents called for a surgeon. Why they waited so long before Joseph could receive professional medical treatment is unknown. Maybe the Smith Smith family had grown to mistrust doctors. Maybe they were relying on prayers or magic or the stars or home remedies. Maybe they couldn't afford a doctor, but maybe Joseph even, it suggests, begged them not to bring a doctor because the last one inflicted so much pain. Whatever the reason, you can't imagine such suffering in a 6-year-old in this day and age and under today's modern medical care. Then comes another man wielding a knife. This time, says Dr. Moran, physical restraint certainly would have been required in order to drain the leg of its poison. Lucy Mack Smith wrote, "The surgeon came, he made an incision 8 inches long on the front side of the leg between the knee and the ankle. No anesthesia was used." When we come back, we'll continue to tell the story about what happened to Joseph as a 6-year-old boy and how it affects the way he formulated revelation. We're back. All right. Joseph's mother wrote, "This action of cutting his leg to the bone from below his knee down the tibia, this relieved the pain in a great measure, and the patient was quietly comfortable until the wound began to heal. When the pain became as violent, then the pain became as violent as ever." Return, end quote. Now, if you've ever had a really bad illness, for instance, a persistent sinus infection or lung infection, and you've gone through several cycles of antibiotics, and you begin to improve, and then suddenly you feel it coming back, you know that it's just a terrible feeling. You wonder if this is the thing that's going to kill you, right? Well, imagine that you are a 7-year-old and you have experienced this pain and you think that this thing the doctor did had healed you or was going to heal you, and suddenly you sense this pain coming back. Couple this with the age-appropriate fantasies of him that could have been there, heightened by his mother's recent attentions, and the fact that it is a man, and most likely men, who would have restrained him during this fleshly castration of his leg, and you get to begin to see the beginnings of this psychic break. But it's only the beginning. A knife-wielding surgeon then returned for a second assault upon his leg. This time, says Dr. Moraine, he would have slashed more deeply into the festering wound, all without anesthesia. and cut away the swollen infected tissues from the underlying tibia bone in an effort to expose a labyrinth of hidden pockets of pus. Dr. Moraine states, by this time Joseph's emotional health should have been as precarious as that of his leg. Having worked with many young boys the same age who have been exposed to repeated treatments of trauma, especially burn victims, Dr. Moraine writes of Joseph, quote, it is doubtful that he would have maintained at any time the normal controls on his behavior that his family had previously come to expect of him. More likely, he would have regressed into more infantile behavior, including loss of bowel and bladder control, with outbursts of nightmares of the most horrible kind. But the worst was yet to come. More factors were now coming to play within the psyche of the young child. His parents, who were supposed to protect him, had him on his mother's side abandon him, and on his father's side actually held him down. Dr. Moraine suggests that Joseph would somehow connect his secret Oedipal thoughts and his guilt of having them with the infliction of pain being heaped upon him by men wielding swords and holding him bound. Under such stresses and or extremes of pain, most children will at some point or another experience what psychologists or psychiatrists call a dissociative disconnect. That is, the mind takes the trauma that you're not able to deal with and separates it or dissociates it into another part of the brain that is a complete secret, dark place that you never think about it at all. Dr. Moraine claims such dissociation occurs quite frequently with children who undergo extreme medical trauma, like physical pain, or who witness something terrifying or horrifying. And they all share these similar responses, which we're going to hear about next week and the following. It's interesting that they use as an example that there was a 4-year-old boy way back in the 40s, I think, who was found wandering along his street, and he was white as a sheet, glazed over, and he was found by neighbors, and they took him to his house, and they could not get out of him what had happened. Then they remembered that the 4-year-old boy was with a friend playing near the train tracks. They went to the train tracks and found his little buddy was completely dismembered by the train all along the tracks. That 4-year-old boy was Stephen King. Even to this day, Stephen King does not remember one single thing about the event that happened when he was a child. What makes dissociation so interesting is the fact that people with dissociated minds will then act, speak, and operate based on the information stored in this separate place in their heads throughout their entire lives, while not actually being able to recall any of the specifics about the traumatic events. Especially it occurs with writers. I would suggest that it would be most like someone placing magic lenses over your eyes and you not knowing it and them coloring everything you see and do. But it wasn't the first 3 operations that completely opened the dissociated place in Joseph's head. This was still happening because his leg had not healed. Again, put yourself in the child's bed. Now you're laying there reeling for who knows how long from an illness and this insipid invasion, and then one day you start to hear the hoof beats of horses coming down the road. Maybe the last time you heard hoof beats was when the doctor came to visit with his sword. Now you hear a growing thunder and then they stop. There's a knock at the door and boot stamps enter the house by the dozen. Suddenly your bedroom door opens and there is not one doctor there, dressed in white, dressed in operation garb, but there are a dozen. All of them bearing their instruments, all of them ready to inflict more pain upon the leg that has suffered the trauma twice. According to Dr. Moraine, the founder of the college where he taught, Dr. Nathan Smith always traveled with the full accoutrements of his practice, and it can be assured that the other 12 men carried those weapons in with them to the bedroom too. This included long knives, clamps, spreaders, and saws to amputate limbs. The intention was to amputate the leg. Unquestionably, the boy was in minimally a sheer state of terror. Then Joseph watched as his mother left the room, who was the recipient of his adoration, and his father would hold him bound with the others while they began to operate on the leg. Remember, this was not the rough and tumble Joseph Smith they paint of this guy on the frontier who was strong and can beat anybody in town at wrestling. This was a 6-year-old boy. Says Moraine, in traditional Western culture, women do the nurturing until it's time for violence. He says, midwives deliver babies, men perform C-sections. Women feed the chickens, men slaughter them. So while Lucy and Joseph's father understood what was going on, Joseph Smith did not, and most likely. Writes Moraine, having tasted the sweetness of his mother's deepest affections just a short time ago, did he witness her leaving him as the climactic act of her betrayal. Somewhere in the boy's mind, it must have seemed that these 12 men with swords were there to act upon the ultimate payment of his body. Maybe they would cut his leg clean off. Certainly a symbol of Oedipal guilt. Of all the instruments that would have terrified him most, the doctor says it's the sword-like instrument used for amputation. This image, as we will see, would never cease to occupy Joseph Smith's fantasies, writings, temple ceremonies, everything that he did. What actually occurred in the room to this day is not known. It was not recorded. Joseph Smith says he did not know. Joseph never recalled any of the details. His mother only recalled screaming and returning to a room that was completely dressed in white without a drop of blood anywhere. Dr. Moraine, using his skills and knowledge of the time, describes the events. We're going to go to the phones after I describe this. 801-973-TV20, 801-973-8820. He writes, the swollen, pus-filled tissues were cleaved once again. The sensitive periosteum was stripped back. The trephinine was drilled and twisted into the bone. The largest chunk of dead bone was pried free with a hook. Blood poured after it. Forceps grabbed smaller chunks and forcefully dislodged them from the fresh edges of the sensitive living tissue. Saws cut through the margins. The geysers of blood was stemmed by cloth packing, and then it was over. Joseph's leg would someday heal. His psyche would not. End quote. This experience, coupled and compounded by a few others, completely explains much of the secret operating system by which Joseph wrote, received revelation, practiced polygamy, and constructed the Book of Mormon. Next week, we'll examine those parallels to that experience with those areas in Mormonism.